Hnrs, welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the Bronze Era Greeks, right? So we left off in class talking a little bit about a myth, a story, to kind of double check and understand, do the Athenians know about the Minoans, and did we know that they knew that we know now that they know?
Hi, Chandler. I miss you already. Oh my God. Oh my God, she knows about us. Joey, do they know that we know?
No.
Joey?
They know you know.
Oh, I knew it! They don't know that we know they know we know. And Joey, you can't say anything.
Couldn't if I wanted to.
Shout out Shelby. I know you like that clip, right? So the big thing about it, though, going into it, is we need to understand that we were leaving off our important discussion of the Minoans from class, where we were discussing a very famous myth, right? Now, the big thing about it is all of you should know this myth already, because at the very, very least, you're in English 2, I believe, right now, and some of you actually have learned about this myth actually last year, right? Now, I know this is going to be a little bit of a weird flip, because I'm going to, clip in some old stuff here in a little bit, because it's just really, really good when I talk about the Myceneans and stuff like that when we get to it, but you'll see when it happens and stuff like that, and we'll kind of, get you all caught up. But the great thing about it is you guys are ahead of pace. We are moving and grooving. We're almost literally cutting straight through halfway of the Greek content already, and we are now already in the Minoans. We're already in our third out of eight Greek time periods. That was embarrassing. I held up 9 fingers. So the big thing about it, though, is, so let's talk about what we left off with in class, right? We were talking a lot about the Minoans. We were talking a lot about their bull artifacts, the bull leaping fresco, the Palace of Knossos, and how it demonstrates to us that there's a decent chance that the Athenians actually may have known about the Minoans due to a myth that they actually had written about 1,000 years later, right? And also in correlation with the artifacts, and then also with the planning, or the city planning itself, of the Palace of Knossos in this labyrinth style. But this myth, this famous myth known as the founding myth of Athens, always actually incorporated this concept of the Cretans, right? It always talked about the Cretans, oh, the Cretans, the da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So the thing about it is the Cretans are the people that they were referring to in Athens as in living on Crete. Well, the most famous of civilizations that ever popped up on Crete were in fact the Minoans. And the very famous national myth of Athens actually goes and plays into the entire idea of the island of Crete, and possibly actually tells us that the Athenians actually knew about the Minoans long before we ever did. And the entire myth revolves around a certain hero by the name of Theseus, right? Theseus, the champion of Athens, who is actually volleyed forward by his father, and he volunteers to go and fight the famous monster that is actually King Minos' stepson, because actually what ended up happening, the reason why there's a half-man, half-bull monster thing right here is because Zeus came down to earth as a bull and hooked up with Minos' wife because Minos was too prideful and stuff like that, and so literally she ends up giving birth to this half-man, half-bull baby, and so what he ends up doing is he builds the labyrinth Palace of Knossos around the entire Minotaur. And that's why literally there was a maze-style format around the Minotaur itself. Well, Theseus is volunteered to go, and he goes, and his dad, Aegeus, the king of Athens, is very, very upset because he doesn't want him to leave. And there's this entire thing about sails on a ship, right? So Aegeus is waiting for him in Athens. He's like, how am I going to know if you're okay? And Theseus tells him, oh, father, well, if I actually am returning and I am alive, the boat will have white sails flying. If I have died, they will be black, right? Theseus sails all the way out to Crete as the hero of Athens who is volunteering himself and things like that. Also, fun fact, we believe that the Theseus and the Minotaur myth is one of the base element line stories of the Hunger Games, the idea of volunteering for a terrible, terrible, terrible game that is actually for the entertainment of the elite. But the big thing about it, though, going into it, is he sails all the way to Crete, and when he gets off his boat in Crete to go and fight the Minotaur, he falls in love with a woman, and the woman's name is Ariadne. And Ariadne, fun fact, is actually King Minos' daughter, right? And so the thing that ends up happening, though, is Ariadne doesn't want Theseus to die, so she prays to the gods for a magical weapon to help him fight the Minotaur. And it's a ball of string. So, it's a big ball of string that never runs out, right? And so, literally, he's supposed to use it to walk his way through the maze. He rolls up on the sleeping Minotaur, slays the Minotaur, gets to marry Ariadne. They go off and they get married on a small island off the coast of Crete. And what ends up going down, though, is he gets too drunk, and then he falls asleep in the boat, and then he forgets to change sails, and then Aegeus, who's waiting for him back at Athens, sees the boat with the black sails on it, gets distraught, and jumps into the sea below on the rocky coastline. And that is why they called it the Aegean Sea, because it is named for King Aegeus, right? And that literally is known as the national myth of Athens. Now, really quickly, though, what's the purpose of myths? What's the purpose of all this stuff to the Greek civilization in general? Well, the big thing about it that you need to understand is the point of myths for Minoans, for Athenians, for Spartans, for all of these people is twofold. One, to explain natural processes they don't quite understand, right? To explain like natural occurrences, right? Zeus is the god of thunder and lightning, of course, so he actually is the elemental reason and cause behind this catastrophic thing, right? Apollo is the god of the sun. He drags the entire thing across the sky, right? And then also, as well, the second reason why you have myths is to actually document historical things or historical events that you believe may or may not have happened, right? So look, biggest thing about it, though, is that why don't we know more, though? If we base most of our understanding about the Minoans and then also some of our cultural understanding about the Minoans upon a myth and then also some rudimentary evidence that we have at the Palace of Knossos and what was left over from it, why don't we know more? Do they have a writing system? That's a great question. They do have a writing system, and the writing system was known as Linear A. But the problem with Linear A is that it is completely undecipherable. We have no idea what this stuff says, and we only have a few samples of it. This one being the most famous of all of them is known as the Phaistos disc, all right? Because literally it was found in the Minoan civilization or settlement of Phaistos. Right now, look, the Phaistos disc, though, completely undecipherable, shows that they may have actually written in a non-linear format, as in literally in a spiralized shape, possibly. Some of the other like writing samples that we have of the Minoans are in linear format, but the problem is, though, is we have no idea what it says. It is not based in any kind of Phoenician phonetic writing. It's not based in any kind of Mesopotamian cuneiform. It is a completely unique system that we do not understand whatsoever, so we now cannot actually translate it. So historians actually rely much more on Minoan art and artifacts to actually understand them, and they actually used or were very, very good at making these things known as frescoes, right? Now, frescoes, what they are, is when you take wet plaster and apply it to a wall, and you have to paint that plaster section before it dries. And then you do another section, and another section, and another section. And what ends up going down, though, is the paint ends up bonding to the plaster itself, making it very, very good at standing the test of time. Now, this right here is a reproduced or restored fresco from the Palace of Knossos, known as the Priests, right? Now, the thing that's interesting about this particular fresco, though, is that these seem to be female priests, right? So what does this tell us? This is an interesting facet about Minoan culture because it may demonstrate to us that female lineage or women may have had a higher or increased status role within the Minoan civilization. One of the chief goddesses that we've discovered in the Minoan civilization, due to relics and artifacts left behind, was actually a snake goddess who literally like stood like this with two snakes in the palms of her hand, right? So the thing about it when we're looking at this entire thing is that this element right here demonstrates a lot to us visually, just like this one does as well. This fresco tells us a lot also because it actually demonstrates to us a lot of different stuff going on. You've got the boats, you've got the sea, you've got things like dolphins leaping in the harbor. You've also got this area which may be possibly a palace or like a city or citadel of some type. It shows us that the Minoans might have been much more of a trade and seafaring people. Now, a lot of kids also oftentimes go like, well, what about all this craziness going on in the background and all these running deer? Could that be like a natural disaster? Possibly, but we do know from some of the evidence that's actually been left behind by some of these frescoes, and also this special one that's well known as the girl gathering saffron. Saffron flowers were are still to this day a very, 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 very hot commodity when it comes to trading, because you can actually make foods and sauces out of the nectar, or not the nectar, but the pollen of a saffron flower. You can also use it as a dye as well, which is probably more likely what it was being used for in this image. But the big thing about it is these two frescoes together kind of show us that the Minoans were much more about trade and art and artistic creation, and possibly more related to the Athenians in their culture than they would have been, say, the Spartans, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, also going forward, is they also kept producing a lot of stuff. This, for example, is known as the Vifo cup, a Minoan cup that we actually have that demonstrates the bull right here, someone attaching it to a rope, and it demonstrates possibly a religious ceremony. This one also is very, very famous as a piece of Minoan art. It's known as the octopus vase, right? So now, look, going into it, though, that you need to understand, no one is positive, though, why, but around 1400, the Minoans all of a sudden began to fall apart, right? Could be a natural disaster, right? We're not positive because it does seem to be like some evidence of seismic activity and things like that actually went down over in their area towards Crete. They also could have been taken over. Now, the interesting thing about this particular artifact, known as the Vifo cup, is actually V-A-I-P-H-O. The Vifo cup actually was not found in Crete. It was actually found in Peloponnese. And Peloponnese is the mainland chunk of ancient Greece, where another group of people known as the Mycenaeans popped up, right? Because right around that time that this cup would have made it over to mainland Greece, this new group of people had traveled in from the grasslands of southern Russia and settled on Peloponnese, and they were known as the Mycenaeans. So it's actually reasonable to consider that maybe, coupled a natural disaster and a military expedition, maybe the Mycenaeans took them over after a natural disaster. And the other big thing that we know about the Mycenaeans is that they are much more warlike, and they rose up on the Greek mainland, and they may have very well conquered the Minoans. But now what I'm going to do is going to clip in a flip from last year, and we're going to talk a lot about the Mycenaeans, their shaft grave era, their Beehive Burial Period era, and then if we get lucky, we'll get all the way to the Greek Dark Ages, right? But I'll see y'all in a second, okay? Be right back. Rise of a new group of people, right? And the new group of people who are going to rise up in Greece are known as the Mycenaeans, right? And the Mycenaeans are culturally very, very, very different from the Minoan people, right? Now, the big thing about it in general is I do not want y'all to get confused about this, though, okay? Because the Minoans were there, the Mycenaeans popped up at one point. You're going to feel a little wishy-washy about some of the dates because they're not like Minoans start, Mycenaeans start, blah, 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 blah. It's like history's not that easy anymore for y'all, right? Because history is kind of a tapestry of a lot of different dates and events and themes that are kind of all occurring at the exact same time, right? And so, like, that means, like, look, Godoy, I know I found out that we had beef, apparently, for 2 years that I didn't even know existed, but please don't fight me about how confusing this might get, all right? So now, look, the biggest thing about it, though, in general, is that you have to understand that they are culturally different from the Minoans, so it does help you when comparing the two of them back and forth, right? We believe that the Mycenaeans are going to migrate from southern Russia and settle in the mainland area of Greece around like 1750 BC, give or take, okay? And the mainland area of Greece is known as Peloponnese, right? Definitely do me a favor and definitely highlight that word, all right? See, that's a word that screams fill in the blank for Mr. Terry, right? Because it's a very unique and very interesting word, and it's a word that I can focus on really well, and I can show you on a map, and so on a fill in the blank, maybe I'll just put the map on there, and I'll ask you, what is that mainland section called? And Peloponnese is located right here, right? So the little triangle is where the Mycenaean city stronghold was located, but this blue chunk of Greece is Peloponnese. And notice, it's very, very close to Crete, which is where the Minoans were actually located as well. But that's where the Mycenaeans are going to settle. And they're culturally really, really different from the Mycenaeans in a replete and huge number of different ways. But the best way to talk about Mycenaean history is to break it into two different phases, right? We analyze the Mycenaeans in two different chunks of their history. This being because it shows us a dramatic leap forward in intelligence by them, right? The big thing about it in general is that the Mycenaeans started off with a little bit more of a primitive setup when the Minoans were actually really, really blossoming and being super intelligent, whereas then later on, they're going to become the very intelligent ones, and this is going to coincide very, very closely right around the time that the Mycenaeans take over what was formerly known as the Minoans, right? And so the big thing to start off with is that sorry about that. The wife called. Now, anyway, the big thing about it, though, that you have to understand is that the Mycenaean history era started out in this thing known as the shaft grave era, right? So notice really quickly, I got a lot of pictures on here, but I don't have a lot of words, which means that you're going to kind of have to like describe this in your own little way a little bit. But the shaft grave era is how the Minoans buried their dead, right? So we actually analyze the Mycenaeans really in a big way by their tombs, right? By where they buried famous dead people. Now, why would we do this, Mr. Terry? Mainly due to the fact that tombs are very well known for preserving a buttload of artifacts, right? So the thing about it is that during the shaft grave era, that's when the Mycenaeans really started building their city stronghold and burying some of their famous dead figures, right? Now the thing about it is the shaft grave era for the Mycenaeans was very, very simple, right? Because a shaft grave, all it was basically just a round little graveyard, very, very simple, tombstones marking where each place was or where each grave was, and this is what this grave looked like in and of itself. Literally, they would just dig a really deep hole or a shaft all the way down about 40 feet, which is really, really deep, and then actually build a stone box down there and tomb and put the body and a lot of items down there inside of it. Like, so they would put tons of things that were sacred to the person that died down there in that tomb with them. But think about this for a hot second. This is why we love to talk about the Mycenaeans, and this is why we knew about the Mycenaeans for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before we ever knew who the Minoans were, because of their burial practices, right? Because their burial sites were so deeply buried that it kept all this stuff perfectly preserved. right? Like, so now we found all kinds of stuff inside of Mycenaean shaft graves, right? And inside those shaft graves, we've noticed a lot of things that are kind of very emblematic of their culture, right? So the big ones that are on this pictures right here, these two things are helmets, right? Helmets that were used by Mycenaean soldiers, and they actually are lined with boar tusks that have been split, right? So it demonstrates to us that maybe Mycenaean warriors were also very avid hunters as well, because wild boar is a very wild game that exists near the Mediterranean, especially in Italy and Greece, right? But these boar tusk helmets show us a lot. We also have found bronze swords and things like that, which shows us that they were maybe militarily advanced or knew how to at least wield bronze and things like that. And we were looking at their city area. They had like a very intricate burial system. This is known as the citadel and the grave circle, where we found a lot of this stuff. But the most famous item that's been ever found inside of one of the shaft graves is actually this gold death mask right here. That thing right there is known as the Mask of Agamemnon, right? Now, Agamemnon is spelled Agemenon, Agamemnon, right? So now, I probably misspelled that, but it's going to be fine. We'll fix it when we're in class, right? Now, Agamemnon is considered one of the most famous Greek history or like Greek figures that has ever been seen. He's also a part of a very famous myth that we'll talk about in this flip as well. Now, the big thing about it, though, in general, is that this probably isn't his mask, all right? So the German archaeologist that actually discovered this thing just said, oh, it must be the Mask of Agamemnon, and we've just named it that, you know what I mean? Like, so, but more than likely, it just like actually belonged to a very, very wealthy Mycenaean in general. But the big thing about it also shows us that they knew how to work with gold, that they actually may have had some access to some money and some wealth and some other, but the thing about it is, when we're looking at these gold like items that we've recovered from these shaft graves and stuff, they're nowhere near on par with the actual artistic development of the Minoans, right? So it demonstrates to us early on in their era, and early when the Mycenaeans were settling their civilization and creating their stronghold and creating their city, that they just weren't as intelligent, probably, like as a community. I don't mean like as people, but like as a community as the Minoans were, right? Now, when we move forward, though, in time, all of a sudden, right around this thing known as the Quine Era, which actually in English means common era, or their Beehive Burial period, right? So it's actually one or the other, right? I'll ask you one or the other on the test. You'll be able to use either or, but actually this era shows a dramatic leap forward in Mycenaean intelligence, and it also coincides with the fall of the Minoans. So that means that now this warrior-like culture, who maybe wasn't as giant-brained as the Minoans, are now starting to become very intelligent, right? And if they're becoming very intelligent and they're taking over the Minoans, maybe they're adopting a lot of their ideas. And we can actually see this in a lot of different things, because the Mycenaean city began to have frescoes on it, which is the artwork that the Minoans did first, right? So that means that maybe they were trading with the Minoans in a really big way, right? We start to see as well new suits of armor made completely out of bronze coming out of some of these Mycenaean graves and stuff like that. And here's the other thing. Speaking of the graves in the tombs took on a distinctly new structure, and we call them the Beehive Burial Chambers, right? Beehive burial chambers are way more complex than those shaft grave chambers, because these are actually built inside of a hill, right? They would actually literally cut into the side of a hill, dig out this massive amount on the inside of it, and line the entire inner chamber with stones. And then that way they could actually put a royal or a king's body on the actual ground, surround it with treasures, hold a funeral, and then they could actually decorate the doorway with sacred stones and things like that. And sheep could be brought in for sacrifice towards the gods as well as this kingly figure. Priests and priestesses would bring offerings of food and wine, and musicians would play things. So this just demonstrates to us that if we're looking at the Beehive graves and the shaft graves, it just looks as though, man, like they just got much more intelligent, right? But here's the thing, though. What's a really, really unique value when somebody becomes smart enough to build these things, but they're also still very warrior-like? That means they're probably going to start going out and taking some stuff over. And so the Mycenaeans begin to push their influence into all these different areas, right? They start taking over many of the islands that surround them. They start really, really advancing all their ideas and spreading their influence and taking over and subjugating a lot of different people, right? They took over what was formerly the Minoan Kingdom at the Palace of Knossos, and you can actually see a very distinct difference between the two of them, especially in the way their cities were designed, right? So the Mycenaeans, these artifacts tell us a lot about them, right? And it tells us that they are a culture that values war, right? They value war in a big way, and you can see it also in the way they constructed their city, right? So remember Knossos was like kind of like marketplace slash palace slash labyrinth slash art expo slash like no wall around it. Mycenae is the name of the Mycenean palace, right? So look, the Mycenaeans built the city known as Mycenae. It's not the most creative name ever, but give them a break. Now, the biggest thing about it in general is that the Mycenean Kingdom, or the Mycenaean city, had one entrance in or out of it, known as the Lion's Gate. And it was heavily fortified by a giant stone wall that went all the way around the outside of it. And raised up on the top of a hillside was this thing known as the Citadel, right? And they had like their religious centers down here. The shaft graves, were actually the oldest part of the city, was down here on the lower end as well. And there is the Lion's Gate, surrounded by this fortified wall with a huge amount of mountains behind them. That shows us and demonstrates to us that the Mycenaeans were always ready for a fight. We're always trying to protect themselves, and we're always ready to make sure that they were the ones that could come out on top, because they were expecting to go to war all the time, not expecting to just go out and find it, right? So they were even trying to protect their homeland, which is a very important element because it just shows us the major differences between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans and their culture and things like that, right? And so looking at this like entrance, that again is the Lion's Gate. That was the only way to get in and out of the entire Mycenean Kingdom. And I believe, this has never been like verified or anything like that, but I believe actually the interesting thing is that there's a film production company now called Lionsgate Films, and I really, really wonder, and I can't find it anywhere online, if they're actually named after each other, right? Like, so like now, the big thing about it though is, what about the Minoans, right? Well, the thing about it is as they're advancing and as this thing like progresses, they bring the Minoans under their control, right? Now, here's another interesting little thing, is the Mycenaeans also had their very own style of writing, and it looked insanely different from the Minoan writing, so we have to give it a separate name. Where the Minoans write in linear A, the Mycenaeans write in linear B, right? And their writing looks intrinsically different, and their writing also looks much more like Mesopotamian / Egyptian / early Greek writing. And the interesting thing about it is, we can actually translate little bits and pieces of this writing, right? We can actually translate it, and we believe that this is the foundation for modern Greek language and writing, right? Now, we also know about the Mycenaeans that they love to go out and take people over, and there's a lot of stories about them doing this, because much like the Minoans had the myth about Minos and the Minotaur, and Theseus and the Minotaur, and the name of the Aegean Sea and where it comes from, probably the biggest story ever in Greek mythology is about the Mycenaeans, right? And it relates to their conquest, because they expanded over most of modern-day Greece, creating a very large military. And every single time they would take over a place, we believe that they would adopt that military into their own and actually kind of like gobble it up, right? So in this process, as we can see it with their growing conquest and the areas of which they are expanding into, because as you can see right over here, they took over all these different cities and kept expanding their influence and bringing the people into their own culture and using them inside of their military. But this is a big deal though. Something you got to notice when we're talking about all this is that looking at this, looks like they're not alone, right? So the Mycenaeans were over here in this pink, and then you have all these other major empires that were around as well that were willing to go to war with the Mycenaeans at the drop of a hat, right? Now, granted, for the Mycenaeans, it was good for them that they were located very far westward, which kept them a little bit safe, but the biggest group of people that they disliked the most was this area in blue right here, known as the Hittites, right? The Hittites and the Mycenaeans did not get along. The Mycenaeans did not like them, mostly due to the fact that the Hittites wanted to control trade coming in and out of the Aegean and also this sector of the Mediterranean Sea. Well, the Mycenaeans were like, we have conquered all of these islands, and this is all of our goods and product. We want to control these trade routes going in and out of here. Now, the thing about it was that the Mycenaeans never wanted to attack the Hittites directly because they thought they might lose, right? But a very important moment in Greek storytelling happened when the Mycenaeans wanted to control more trade, right? And this whole thing is their myth that relates to the Mycenaeans, right? It actually comes from this story known as the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Trojan War, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is that this was written about like 700 years later. Again, just like the Minoan one, written over 1,000 years later by the Athenians. This is one of them that was written about 700 years later by this guy named Homer, and we'll talk about him here in a second, right? The big thing about it, though, is that the Iliad and the Odyssey revolve around a historical event that we do know actually happened between a war between the city-state of Troy and the city-state of Mycenae, or in the Mycenaeans. So here are the Mycenaeans, and here, right there, is the city-state of Troy, right? Now, the city-state of Troy may have actually aligned or allied with the Hittites, really, really making the Mycenaeans mad and leading to this massive war that broke out between them and the Trojans, right? Now, looking at this entire thing, we do believe it was motivated by trade in real life, right? Like, we believe that the real-life event known as the Trojan War was probably motivated by trade. But there's this entire mythological story about what actually happened, and it all boils down to a woman, right? All boils down to a woman who apparently had a face so beautiful that she could launch 1,000 ships. And her name was Helen of Troy, right? So the way the story goes...
3 hours later.
And that's it right there. We're going to wrap it up right there, kind of leave that period off with the Mycenaean stuff, and I'll see y'all in class tomorrow, okay? Y'all are doing a great job. Keep up the fantastic work. Big shout-outs go out to all of you, including like the Brooke Brauns of the world who worked very, very hard, Lily Weaver who worked very, very hard on that test, and it shows, and y'all are doing great stuff, so keep up the good work. I'll see y'all soon.